Okay, so we are live now. Good evening, everybody. This is Srija from the team Voices into the Past or Otit Probaho. Today, we are honored to have among us Dr. Shruti Kapila. She teaches modern Indian history and global political thought at University of Cambridge and is fellow and director of studies at Corpus Christi College. She is the editor of An Intellectual History for India and the co editor of Political Thought in Action, the Bhagavad Gita and Modern India, Cambridge Press 2014. Her writings have appeared in leading academic journals such as Past and Present, Public Culture, Modern Intellectual History, Financial Times, India Today, and Prospect. In her upcoming book, Violent Fraternity in the Indian Age, published by Princeton University Press and Penguin Random House, she argues that it was in India that modern political languages were remade through revolution that defied fealty to any exclusive ideology and explores how foundational questions of politics were addressed in the shadow of imperialism to create both sovereign India and the world's first avowedly Muslim nation, Pakistan. Today, she is going to give her lecture on the topic Gadar, Violence and Political Potential of the Planet. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Srija, and thank you also to Himadri. This is actually my first Zoom talk outside of my university. And it's a great pleasure to be hosted by two such dynamic young students from Presidency and Jadavpur. So I think I should just sort of, so thank you again. And as was said in the very full introduction, this is actually a chapter of my book. It's in fact the second chapter of the book. And in fact, the book in a way began by, I was not thinking of writing about Gadar, but I was working on Tilak, and it was a relationship with Tilak and some of these people. And then it's kind of huge global dimension that I was sort of struck by. And so let me, without a further ado, because there are quite a few elements in this talk, let me say quickly, of course, we all know what the Gadar is. It is the largest, as it were, anti-imperial violent insurrection, global insurrection of the 20th century. And I will explain the name and why this name is taken for the so-called, I don't think it's a movement. But before I do anything, let me just say what I'm not doing. So if you look at accounts of the Gadar, of which there are now several, it is seen to be a precursor or a chapter in the history of communism, or it is seen to be even as part of anarchism, or perhaps even as a kind of a chapter in the territorial nationalism of India, the history of territorial nationalism in India. So I will not be approaching it as a kind of instance or even a prehistory of any of these ideas. And it is certainly not being approached here as it has been approached more recently, say by Maya Ramnath's work, which sees it as anarchism, but also as a history of, as it were, the diaspora. So of course, it is any and all of these things, but it cannot be folded into these big categories. And that's really the starting premise of my talk. The second way in which the Gadar has acquired recent attention, and this is again that I will be critiquing, is that the Gadar is posited as a kind of global counterpoint to the settled history of nationalism. So you have the nation and the global as oppositional categories in which, as it were, Gadar belongs to the global history, as it were. So my argument is here straightforward, but it will become very clear that this is not the oppositional category to the globe or to the global is actually not the national, but the human subject. So it would be a new kind of human subject which would collide very self-consciously with the planetary and the global, to which I will pay some attention to here. Finally, I have this word potential in the title. And here, that is also deliberate and returns to the opening argument that this is not a prehistory of any of these settled political ideologies or major political ideologies. But I see the word potential as an opening which the Gadar forced between empire and the national. So it is a militant, fairly militant, self-conscious, anti-statist political subject who forces this opening by calling into question the strongest principles of both empire and nation, but will not be folded back into it. So the point being that this cannot be easily folded into the history of just simply in some incoherent anti-imperialism, nor can it be seen simply as a kind of external history of Indian nationalism, but rather that it forces and calls into question the strongest principles that hold empire and hold the national. And there'll be three elements through which I will be discussing this. First will be the importance of secrecy for this movement. Second, so that will relate to the kind of human subject or the political subject that the Gadar in a way projects, stages. And finally, there will be some discussion on pan-Islamism and the collision with, as it were, the Gadar with what came to be called the Tehreek-e-Rumal or the Silk Letter controversy when the Provisional Government of India is declared in 1915. And the argument there is, again, that it is not simply about extraterritoriality, but the final point being that India in this story becomes the pivot and the center of Islam. So let me start. I will be doing a bit of reading from my computer screen, and I will also gloss a little bit because it's a fairly long chapter and all quite interconnected. So let me start by showing you an image, which is right here on your screen. It is a very famous mural made by a very famous 20th century artist named Diego Rivera. And you will see the man who was at some point married also to the more famous, I suppose, Frida Kahlo. This hangs in the Education Ministry of Mexico. And on the right, you have Lenin. And next to Lenin and on the other side is a figure also of a man, an Indian man, as in South Asian Indian man, named Pandurang Khankoje. Now, Khankoje belonged to the story of the Gadar, who ends up in Mexico and becomes a very famous agricultural agriculturalist, experimentalist, and where he helps, as it were, the ministry there. But his story is something that we will touch upon. But let me start by saying that at the start, or at some time in 1920, Lenin met Khankoje in Moscow. And Lenin, as we know, had invested revolutionary hopes in Khankoje's mentor, the Maratha leader Bal Gangadhar Tilak. But it was not the admiration for Tilak that had brought Khankoje to Russia, or the fact that Lenin met them, but of course the reference is what allows for this meeting to happen. Khankoje is also joined by another Bengali young middle-aged man. They both are middle-aged at this point. Chatto, as in, and also this is, of course, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, who was known as Chatto, and who had also showed up in Moscow via Berlin towards the beginning of towards the end of the First World War. The secret spirit behind this meeting was the figure named Hardayal. And Himadri, if we can move to the second slide. So this is Hardayal, who's a man from Punjab, who is really the figurehead of this movement of the Gadar, and which involved several thousand men and became the largest armed movement against the British Empire. 20 years after this meeting, that is on the eve of the Second World War, both Chatto and Hardayal were dead. Chatto was killed by Stalin in Leningrad in 1937, a fact that becomes only clear after, in fact, Jawaharlal Nehru gets the papers opened in the late 1940s as to what happened to Chatto. He, of course, he was Sarojini Naidu's brother as well. But it's Kankoje, Dhadayal was, of course, found dead in his final journey to America in a kind of nondescript hotel in Philadelphia. Now, some people speculate why that might have been, but those are not things that interest me. Kankoje, however, had escaped both the communist Russia, Imperial Britain, India, and indeed continental Europe. By the time of the 1940s and the Second World War, he lived a life of a settled emigre in Mexico, married to a Belgian wife, had 2 kids, and as I said, was also immortalized in this mural. So on the eve of the centenary of the Indian rebellions, or of 1857, which is after which the Gadar is named, Kankoje returned to independent India and lived his final years in Pune in 1956. So now if you look at this story, you think, oh my God, this is, the first world, America, the second world, the so-called second world, Russia, Soviet Union, and then of course the third world, and the world of hunger and the struggle with agricultural and food security that these 3 men represent. But actually creeping behind this chronology of world history is the landmark event of modern Indian history, the mutiny or rebellion, which is really what brings these people together. While its naming still defies consensus, the word, the import can entirely be conveyed simply by the citing of the year 1857. So in a direct and deliberate echo of 1857, Gadar, which approximately translates both as rebellion and chaos, but also as sedition or treason, was a name given to a series of violent acts, events, and that occurred from Shiraz to Shanghai to Singapore, from Kabul to Kanpur via California, and from London to Lahore to Laos to Bushehr to Berlin to Benares, spanning the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Indeed, many more towns, cities, and ports could be added to this tricontinental geography of violence across Asia, Europe, and America. The prime movers of these actions were Dhadayal and Kankoje, with the support of several thousand students, laborers, peasants, and soldiers. These Gadaris, or insurgents, were shadowed also by imperial spies, and their actions resulted in a slew of conspiracy trials, memorably associated with particular cities and towns, such as the Lahore conspiracy trials or the Delhi conspiracy trials, and so on. So while, of course, these were seen as conspiracies, the secret societies and all of this entire story is given for the first time a comprehensive imperial narrative in the Rowlatt Report. The infamous Rowlatt Report cast a kind of coherent narrative for the decade starting from 1908 to 1918, in which these stories were central. And what the Rowlatt Committee was trying to do was to actually start with the murder of Rand by the Chapekar brothers in Pune, which was inspired by Tilak's activities, to Bengal, Punjab, Madras, but also the so-called, what was called at that time, the Mohammedan current. But it was really fixated, if you read the Rowlatt Report, with the Gadar movement, because the problem with the Gadar movement was that it defied any provincial location within India or elsewhere. Now, there were twofold issues, which I can't get into detail with the Rowlatt Report. One, that the existing laws of sedition were seen to be insufficient for the managing of what was seen to be extraterritorial activities. And in this wonderful new work by Joseph McQuaid, it shows that the first kind of the genealogy of the global laws on terror, in fact, came from this Rowlatt Report and Gadar activities. So it was about emergency laws, but it was also, the Rowlatt Report was also interested in, as it were, giving a local fix to this arc of activity. But it was, as we also know, it was the findings of the Rowlatt Committee that were being protested against, or people had gathered in Amritsar in 1919, or for the infamous Amritsar massacre, part of actually the impulse behind that meeting was the relatives of the Gadar movement, because they had the war had ended, and there were going to be a large number of reprisals against the so-called Gadaris who had joined in this kind of movement against the British Empire. And these fears were not, this fear of retribution was not misplaced, because just by the time of the Jallianwala Bagh meeting, and in a period of just 2 years, say from 1913 to 1915, 280 Gadaris just from Punjab were tried, 50 were hanged, and the majority were sent to transportation for life. So the emergency laws, the punishment, the surveillance, as well as the Amritsar massacre, form one side of the imperial narrative for this very major account. Now, nationalist accounts, on the other hand, have portrayed, it's changed now, as this kind of a silent decade in Indian politics, which is seen to be a gap between the end of Swadeshi movement and, as it were, the internment and exile of various leaders of the Swadeshi movement, and the dramatic arrival of Mohandas Gandhi at the end, at the other end. So this decade is seen to be a quiescent decade. But actually, this decade belonged to what has been recently termed by Tim Harper as the Asian underground, because Gadar erupted forcefully across the planet during the supposedly quiet decade. But it was not simply a shadow replica of imperial globalization, which is to say that it didn't simply connect the disparate locales and societies through the way in which empire had, as it were, connected. So the imperial anxiety and surveillance actually was trying to see connections and a synchronicity and even coherence. It was trying to give coherence to the welter of underground activities of this age. Though decidedly all these figures were anti-colonial, they were rarely vocalized any systematic creed. But it would be more fair to say, much like Harper says, that these activities left its residue in other ideologies. So whether it was revolutionary communism or anarchism to internationalism or nationalism. So it's Gadar which leaves a residue rather than it being, as it were, a prehistory of it. Now, having said this, let me just sort of point out some of the major, as it were, events which kind of brings it into spectacular visibility. This first and foremost is, of course, the attempted assassination in 1911 in the Delhi Darbar of Viceroy Harding. The second, of course, is the Singapore Mutiny of 1915, and also that became what was called a Euro-Islamic condominium. But these simultaneous events also were projected into the third and most important set of controversies, which was the Silk Letter controversy in Afghanistan, which then, of course, gets propelled into the so-called Great Game of Empire, which then came to be called the German Hindu Conspiracy, in which the German Kaiser and his counselors had in fact courted and sponsored these Gadaris. Now, several Indian insurgents, including Hardayal, made their way to Berlin on the eve of the First World War. Now, we'll come to what happens in the First World War. The story starts actually slightly earlier in America, of all places, but via London. So let me say that what is important to say is that while the empire saw this as a conspiratorial set of activities, there was actually nothing conspiratorial about it. It was actually a form of open secrets that Gadar operated with. The global here is understood as a totality and as an abstraction that finds its specification in a new subject that appears on the horizon of the 20th century. So a new kind of political subject is birthed, which gives a glimpse to us of what might this abstract thing called the global. Contra recent historical approaches that posit, as I say, the nation state as the oppositional category to the global and privileged connections and networks, the emphasis here is on a new political subject and the particular politics that it generated, which was writ large across the world in this period. A new subject marked by its capacity for sacrifice, rendered the planet as a whole by a deliberate and militant mobility, the open horizon of politics. Such a potentiality, it is argued here, was predicated on the subjective and the individual rather than upon any institutionalized form of politics, whether romantic, revolutionary, or realist. So instead of actually folding them into some systematic synthesis, in reconstructing the ideas, acts, and biographies of the Gadar as a disjointed bricolage, it attends to the primacy of secrecy that lent credence to and provided the crucial context for a new subject-oriented horizon of a political fraternity. So with sacrifice and martyrdom as the professed goals of its self-fashioning, such a heightened and even exaggerated politics of the self was directly related to the very character of the 20th century. That is to say, that the 20th century itself had a subjectivity or a personality which deliberately sought to confront history. With violence as its preferred and visible language of communication. So violence is not simply a means to an end, but I argue it is a form of communication. Gadar spectacularly posited an opening and a rupture between the settled forms of nation and empire. The global, in other words, did not amount to the extension of physical scale, but through the militant subject became a site of potentiality, a space that pointed to an irreducible gap between nation and empire, but above all, between the possible and the actual. So what is the Gadar? So if we can have the next slide, you can see some map here, or you can see some flags here. So Gadar, so these are the Gadaris, these are the people, these are the peasant laboring men from Punjab primarily on the west coast of the Americas who were going to be tried. And let's move to the other, this is post the Rowlatt Act. Yeah, so this is really what the Gadar pamphlet material looks like, and this was its flag. So on 5 June 1913, Gadar was declared from the west coast of America as a message of chaos and insurrection. The message was broadcast to the planet, revolving from New York to the rest of the world. In packed auditoriums in Astoria and Berkeley, Hardayal, its architect and author, announced Gadar not as a political party or even less as a movement, but as a pledge, an oath to become an insurgent or Gadari. So these men, so the point was that everyone would come together and they would take this oath. This oath was called, I'll read it out: salary, death, reward, martyrdom, pension, freedom, field of battle, Hindustan. So of course, so it did not in a way have a kind of political manifesto, but the form of incorporation of joining the Gadari was actually to take an oath. And intensely secretive, small and intimate, Hardayal's vision of Gadar as a political formation was actually in contrast to the workings of a political party. A few days after he finished the first public lecture, he wrote to his friends that all this was fine to express political ideas. And he says, but I do not attach too much importance to public lectures. A lecture is only a kind of drum to get people together. The real work, I quote, begins with the slow interpenetration of personalities. So it was with this view of self-making that he set up which was sometimes called the Yugandhar Ashram or the Bakunin Institute. It could be a hostel, it could be a commune, it could be an ashram where men lived together in Oakland, California. Ostensibly, the work was to publish and distribute propaganda across the world, most famously Gadar Di Gunj or Echo of 1857. But whether these activities took place within what was variously known as the ashram or the institute, these practices took the form of ascetic practices, of individual labor, and what it amounted to in the end was a form of a secret society. In other words, as opposed to a party, commune, or ashram, Gadar's principles were closer to the workings of a secret society. Hardayal had spent 2 years in the Swadeshi era in a foremost secret society of the India House in London, set up by its revolutionary and wealthy patron, Shyamji Krishna Varma. As is well known, several Indian nationalists, including Gandhi and Savarkar, at one time or another were either housed there or visited this innocuous Hampstead mansion. Its form was replicated by other India houses, notably in the two corners of the world in New York and in Tokyo by Barkatullah, whom I will end with later. In specific contrast to an organized party and its principle of the people to be represented, the Yugandhar Ashram that became the Gadar headquarters and the nodal point in a militant global mobility that was based on the individual belonged to a secret fraternity. Such a flimsy organization of men meeting and living in secret, and in fact came closer to the term party, which means division, side-taking, or separation. This was indeed the world of what has been called the partisan, who is a part or a partner in a guerrilla fight. To this extent, a separation was forged by the complete rejection of social norms such as marriage, but also of public arena of associations and parties as conventionally understood. As a secret society, the ashram's intimacy was a mirror to the alienating and abstract nature of the planet, and Gadar sought to mobilize these two opposing aspects by a militant engagement against the empire. So people were not allowed to marry and so on. The rejection of social ties and the pledge to remain unmarried consecrated a bond that implied the purity of male work. In seeking to reconstitute political subjectivity, the purpose of the Yuganthar ashram was to singularize a form of agency in which discrete elements of work and social relationships were to be brought together in a commitment to the secret fraternity. What Hardayal had aimed for was a not large-scale movement, but a select set of young men, preferably, as he said, sons of moneylenders and landlords, who could live and work in close proximity, but would die apart, yet bound in the intimacy of their common cause. Let us form a secret society of those who prefer death became the declaratory affirmation of Gadar's cellular formation. Within a few months, its membership had reached 5,000, with several such societies in America alone. Aspiring members were inducted into the ashram by 2 existing members and had to go 6 months of probationary work before political trust could be shared. Epitomizing the key principle of a secret society as that of offering potential invisibility, the ashram and Gadar, as a result, was a radical formation. Which is to say, while individual members were connected by a secret, the group or collective that it was forged was, however, concealed. So the secrecy is both, it is therefore hard to describe the Gadar as a party or even as a movement in any conventional sense, as it is individual biographies of martyrdom and betrayal that give it any nominal or collective identity. So Gadar could, of course, be conceived as a conspiracy by its opponent, the imperial state. Decentralized as a secret cell and subsumed in the anonymity of an American suburb, Yuganthar ashram induced imperial fear precisely because its concealment defied control. So it was secret as a collective. Yet the oath taken by its members served to conjure an alliance, political and tacit, that was ultimately defined by a commitment to combat a political adversary. The individual member or Gadri founded a politics that was secret in origin, with no point of return or settlement in any home, but was defined instead by constant movement or mobility, whose effects became visible, if not spectacular. It was therefore a secret society par excellence, dependent on the individual who was part of a concealed collective. Hardayal described its members as social dynamite, explosive in nature, much like the bomb-making activities and the poetic propaganda that detonated across and through the imperial and global postal system. The individual that prefigured this politics was an outcome of deliberate disruption. The ashram's life is often portrayed as a romantic utopia, an egalitarian microcosm of India's diversity, with Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus united in their work against an oppressive empire. Often presented as the metanemoron for the ideal nation, or even a repressed but imagined revolutionary party, the Gadar and its cellular fraternity was in fact the opposite. Secret societies, whether these were the Masonic lodges of the Victorian age, or those common to traditional societies, or even those indulged in by various men of letters, such as Freud, have been popular but feared. Marked by the privatization of trust, the secret society, above all, as classically understood by George Simmel, offers a possibility of a second world alongside the manifest world. This second world of alterity and fraternal secrecy is based on reciprocity of information and behavior. The secret itself is the basis of the bond that infuses it with mystical powers and intense intimacy. It is in this sense the cause of the nation, however nebulous, acquired a mystical power. This was because it was precisely in her name that the oath was taken to die so that the nation could come alive. And here I could just give you one very famous poem by Kartar Singh Saraba. In fact, a little town outside Chandigarh is now called Saraba Nagar, Mohali, is named after him, who was hanged at a very young age, precisely for this. He was a Gadari, and he had, and he said, let me just say, I'm a particle, this is a poem in Punjabi I've translated, I'm a particle of the ravaged India's ruins. This is the only name I have, the only hallmark, the only address. Oh, Mother India, this is not to be my fate, my good fortune, that with every moment of mine, I could have worshipped your feet. Oh, Mother India, if my head is offered, my life is sacrificed in your service, then I would understand, even in my death, I will attain a life of eternity. So death or sacrifice became the promissory note of life itself. Yet between these absolute poles of death and eternity lay the work of disruption, individual and mobile, that traversed the planet and left a landscape of potentiality unmoored from any theological base, even though martyrdom is a virtue and cornerstone of both Sikhism and Islam. The sacrifice or the reckoning of death, the argument here emanated from a profound understanding or a lack of constituents of a deficiency. I don't want to get too theoretical, but let's just say the idea is that there is a lack here, which is there is no nation. And the idea by dying is that you bring two negatives, which will make a positive. Very simply put, this in a way becomes very simple calculus in the way in which Gadar thinks of it itself. So this is therefore not surprising that Saraba invoked his own subjectivity as a particle of the ruin called India, individual yet dissolved in its fabric. Though he served and worshipped the ruin, a living relationship with her was only confirmed by denial and impossibility. So this is how, in a way, this very sacrificial politics would acquire a huge visibility across the empire and even beyond. And as I said, it would be premised, this disruption would be premised on three things: a rejection of settled employment, rejection of marriage, and a commitment to mobility, as in to move across areas, but above all, to death. So this is really what, in a way, coheres this bricolage of various activities. So whether it was Hardayal, Saraba, Khankoje, Pingle, VVS Iyer, they all, in a way, some of them were trained lawyers, they all gave it all up, and this is what they ended up doing. And as a result, then they get followed up and by imperial surveillance. In fact, just as a footnote, these surveillance campaigns are so successful, they form, as it were, the precursor to Britain's MI6. It's a major international bit of the espionage, the world of, say, James Bond and the like. So in a way, a new subject is formed on these commitments, in which, as it were, the theological base is taken away, and what is seen to be this individual has to be sacrificed in a moment of confrontation, and this individual is made out of a combination of willpower and despair. And you see this also with figures like Madan Lal Dhingra. There's a whole slew of such characters, certainly young men, from about 1905 to about 1920. And this is, so this is how Hardayal conceives of this project when he leaves London and hides in Algiers after the failure of the Swadeshi, but also a failed assassination attempt. And then he's on the run, and he shows up in America. And he says, I don't go away from anger, caprice, or anything of the kind, but from foresight and deliberation. Much is at stake. All earnest youths of northern India are watching me. I was horribly tempted to fall and become a mercenary in occupation for the sake of living in Paris and regaining my strength by a quiet, regular life. I was inclined to do it, but as I thought and thought, I discovered that it was not necessary to fall at all if I could only give myself the trouble of journeying and leading an irregular life of some hardship and uncertainty. So he kind of leads by example, and by producing a kind of disruptive selfhood, in which, and then in a way lands in America, from where the Gadar is announced. I don't have time to say this, but anti-statism or this kind of subject is actually part of a wider political thinking of this period, starting with Tilak, but also Gandhi and even actually Savarkar. And in the middle of all this is actually the Gadar project, which sits in a way between Tilak and Hindutva. So the Gadar would, the planet or the global would emerge through a militant mobility as the horizon of a new subject. The Gadri lay above and below the nation, but never in a settled living relationship with it. The despair, hope, and terror that formed the subjective terrain of the Gadar was not counterpoint. They were not simply counterpoints to the patterns of life, whether of employment or sacrifices that people made, but they were actually necessary along with willpower and a combination of discipline and preparedness that formed a subject who would appear as a combatant and a partisan in dispersed locality. Significantly, the novelty of the 20th century became the context for a radical apprehension of time that grounded this subjectivity which joined in together, which is to say, it's a Nietzschean century which demands confrontation with the past, if not, as it were, overcoming the past. So it is this confrontation with history that the Gadar is looking for, which is precisely why it names itself as Gadar di Gunj, which literally means echoing 1857. I have a long section in the book on it, but main point is that this is simply not a repetition for the sake of redemption, but rather what it is that this, so it's not the idea that they will repeat the failures of 1857, so that this time round, 50 years later, all that failed could be revolutionary or could be successful. In fact, it is the opposite, that it is not trying to summon a failed past, but what it is trying to do is that it is trying to immobilize the flow of time itself. It's wanting to call time on empire, which is why 1857 becomes a time of reckoning. And there are plenty of poems which are also glossed, in which, as it were, it says that it would be a false dawn. The word is used that it would be a false dawn if it was merely a repetition of 1857. In fact, what it was doing, the Gadar that was declared on 13 June 1912, was in effect a declaration of the end of the past. More to the point, this date was taken as the chosen moment when the account book of history was to be closed and scores settled. It is striking that one of the most widely circulated pamphlets of Gadar, Aankhon Ki Gawahi, or an eyewitness account, is simply a handbill in 2 columns in which figures on one side of the page recorded are of the Indian population and the number of Indian soldiers, while the other column detailed taxation figures and the number of Indians who had died in imperial wars. At a superficial level, this amounted to a political and economic critique of empire and stark statistics for maximum impact. From another point of view, it could be argued that such an absolute accounting also reflected a particular disposition towards history itself. History seen as an account sheet of death, taxes, and blood that could only be measured from the perspective of Judgment Day, when time itself had been halted. So in a way, it is forcing an interval in time rather than repeating the past. So what are these guys doing? I have a little 15, 20 minutes. What I will do is very quickly, I mean, of course, there's a debate with Marx, and Hardayal's rejection of Marx is very widely cited, his article on Marx and revolutionary politics. So why he doesn't believe in that, because, you know, much like Gandhi, there is an issue with the state. And I think I can take questions on it. So what really happens is that you have with Rash Bihari Bose in Tokyo, with, as it were, the Yugantar circular coming out, there is a kind of declaration of this moment, and he says, you know, and the Yugantar circular, which says, the bomb has come as a fitting conclusion to the Darbar. May darbars and bombs go together. You know, this is actually a direct replication of what actually Tilak had argued about 10 years earlier, which had actually called the bomb a democratic form of a democratic weapon, because it allowed for, as it were, not simply the oppressor and the oppressed to come together in the same moment of death under this kind of weapon, which is not a huge weapon, but can be assembled quite easily. But the point of the bomb was that it was a highly visible form of violence in which, as it were, what underlied power structures became visible. And this was why it would become a very highly, as it were, romanticized, but highly extolled idea. The bomb would not simply be a weapon, it would also be an idea. And it would also be, as I argue at length, as a form of communication. So these spectacular events involving bombings and subsequent hangings, the aim of such a politics was in the end to give subjectivity to the abstraction of violence itself. So the point was that the imperial violence was seen to be too abstract. And this, in a way, this politics, which began with the individual subject, was seeking to circle a square by deifying death through the work of chaos, mobility, and insurrection. Its most theatrical moment came, of course, in the First World War itself, where the very spectrally, very momentarily, the fixity of the global territory of empire itself was undone. So if you look at the Gadri in a way is very much like the partisan that Carl Schmitt describes in his book by the same name, which is to say that emerging from and belonging to a party, but with an intense, not belonging necessarily to a party, sorry, but with intense political character, the partisan for Schmitt is above all an irregular fighter whose horizon is shaped by and is dependent on the regularity he challenges. So it's a kind of oppositional relationship. You have the regularity of the state, of the armies, and very abstract violence. And the partisan emerges as an individual, subjective, very visible, very irregular, very mobile, very technically agile as a figure. And this is exactly what you can say the Gadri is. And here, the key Gadri who epitomizes this. If Hardayal was, as it were, the ideas man, then Kankoje is the real Gadri. So can we have the next few things? Very quickly, I will gloss through what he does through images. So these are the kinds of pamphlets which were made, and they were sent across the world in Persian, Urdu, many, many languages. And then let's go further down. So these you can't see, but yeah, let's go further down. Let's take here, next one itself. So these are images of Aleppo and Persian camps. This is where, in a way, the Kankoje, along with a large number of, or smaller bands of revolution or Gadris, attack the British Empire through what is called a third-party war. And he is all over Persia. He is all over Iraq, but he also ends up in Baluchistan, and in a way he loses contact with all of his people. So there was the date which was announced when the big global gather was going to take place. So you have the Singapore Mutiny, you have Kankoje in Persia, they're all everywhere, and you have, as it were, the bombings of major not just railway lines, but also ammunition depots in Punjab and in the hinterland. So it's a kind of series of coordinated events. But of course, these guys this is not connected by the internet or any such thing. So these guys, of course, lose touch with each other. And Kankoje is, in a way, stranded in the middle of the war in what is in West Asia. And he, of course, changes his garb, and he shows up in, he's desperate to return to Bombay, and he does via Persia, Bam, and so on. And there's a very, very interesting story in this, which is to do with Sufi Amba Prasad, also a Punjabi Gadri, a Sufi, a Hindu who converted to Islam and is now buried in Persia. So there's a major campaign. These are, this involves the highest and the highest kind of echelons of British army to bring these third-party warfares down in the theaters of the First World War. Kankoje returns at great peril to Girgaon in Bombay to meet Tilak to say, well, what next? And Tilak says, "Leave the country. I mean, are you nuts? They're going to hang you." And so he, of course, and he's then leaves and refuses to join communism, refuses, like several people, to go to, unlike, say, Chattu. So these people just go in different directions. M.N. Roy tries to revive another bit of the Gadar, but doesn't take place in Southeast Asia. And so this gets dispersed, partly because the imperial state and imperial surveillance is good, but also the war doesn't go the German way or the Gadri way. But even before the Germans lose it, someone like Kankoje, most of them, and certainly Hardyal, were not communists. So he joins he's revolutionary, and he goes to the Mexican front and ends up there in the Mexican, new Mexican establishment. So there is a kind of, whereas Hardyal in 1915 itself has decided that the German world is going to conduct a race war, and it would be terrible for Indians to join that empire, and so gives up and goes to Switzerland, and because he's a man without a passport, and would eventually return to London in the early 30s. So this in a way becomes quite spectacular. But the main story, which I want to end with, is that the main theater, so these people disperse, and the main theater is really the very spectacular declaration of the provisional government of India in Kabul. So can we see the next bit? So these are the kinds of pamphlets. It's called the United States of India. These are more pamphlets further down, please, Himadri. One more, please. Next slide. So this is Kankoje. These are, of course, his wounds from the First World War. And there he is with his celebrated idea of corn that he had kind of innovated and is now became the part of the staples of Mexico. And finally, let's see, where are my three? So yeah, this is called the Silk Letter Movement. Some of you might know it, or Reshmi Rumal, Tehrike Reshmi Rumal, which is a Silk Letter conspiracy, so-called conspiracy, which is further finally, let's have the final slide here, which involves these three men. So on the left is Muhammad Barkatullah of Bhopal, who is also a friend of Hardyal's, who is, in fact, they all have these sort of dangerous kind of jobs as academics, and they lead these kind of not dual lives, but they start off in academia, some of them, or certainly in life of letters. So Barkatullah was in Tokyo on a job which was actually sponsored by the House of Tartars, and then shows up in England, and then finally, he's interested in with Lenin, but is interested in figuring out the question of Islam and empire. And the last, the person on the extreme right is Ubaidullah Sindhi, known also for coalescing the question of Islam with socialism. And in the middle is a very decadent prince from as it were, Uttar Pradesh, Hathras, infamous of these days for different reasons. And this is Maharana Mahendra Pratap. And these three people really are central to this story, where in a way these letters are written that they're carrying in silk in silken cloth, asking for help from various, particularly Muslim leaders, to overthrow the British Empire. In fact, there is a hijrat which is called, and tens of thousands of Muslims from India are given a call by none other than Azad, and they all show up at Kabul for this confrontation. Of course, the British catch it, and everyone is either imprisoned, returned, or hanged. Barkatullah escapes and goes back to America, but again, a man of different ideological dispositions. He's willing to take Mussolini's help. He's also willing to talk to Lenin, but is never really committed to either of these formations. He also writes on the Khilafat, but in the end ends up in the other headquarters and dies in California. Mahendra Pratap would just be a kind of rich man revolutionary tourist, I should say, if I can use that word, who allows for this provisional government to be formed through Kabul, and where actually it is declared, and I will end what the significance of that would be. You'll have to wait for about 5 minutes to conclude. And of course, Ubaidullah Sindhi on the last is kind of wants to radicalize an older Muslim geography between the Hejaz, which is Mecca and Medina, which is where he taught, and is coming, as it were, he wants to kind of pivot into, as it were, the older, greater West Asian, West Arabian geography of Islam for the purpose of India, and wants to see a coalition between, as it were, socialism and Islam. And in fact writes several treatises to that effect. But what does all of this mean? I mean, these are like big lives, big events, and, it's colliding with the First World War, colliding with, and in fact, what happens is that the government is declared, and the president of Kabul is also declared as the second caliph, or second caliph, and in a way that the importance of this collision with pan-Islamism, the declaration of the second caliph in terms of Afghanistan as opposed to Turkey, shows that what this movement does is it territorializes the idea of Islam in India. India would become, as it were, the center of a new political Islam, failed or otherwise. And I think it's instructive even for the last century, our century, where again Afghanistan, South Asia becomes actually quite important to the so-called war on terror. So I think it's an interesting geography which we miss, but the greatest effect of this movement would be, in a way, to actually cause a break between Islam and Arabia and Islam and India. A new territoriality of global Islam would emerge. So let me conclude by what these very disparate things, and I prefer to see them as disparate rather than, as I said, prehistories of various isms, various 20th century isms, is really about the term potential. And I'll speak for last 4 minutes, and then I will conclude and take questions. So really, so in a way, the events in Kabul helped to dismantle the idea of a unitary global brotherhood or ummah, as India became politically preeminent for the global life of 20th century Islam, and this will have repercussions and the like. Yet, okay, I'd best read it. Such a flip between a deterritorialized India, which the Ghadar staged, sought to redistribute Islam's territory ephemerally and spectrally, even through the provisional government and the story of the Silk Letter controversy, and endowed Kabul with the potential to repeat a historical sequence. Ghadar, having identified itself with the memory of 1857, it is striking that it is Kabul that resurfaced in the 21st century as the new pivot of a militant Islam. Ghadar's commitment to violence as communication, militancy as mobility, and the disruption of institutionalized politics premised on the death drive of sacrifice remains instructive. In its aftermath, of course, the state rearmed itself, yet primarily it was the global that emerged as an abstract totality, mirroring the subjective nature of Ghadari politics. This is to say, the subjectivity or the individual life of the Ghadari derived its meaning and dimension from the abstract nature of the planet itself. The militant mobility momentarily unfixed territorial demarcations, thus opening the possibility of the global as a political landscape or horizon. It was precisely the inchoateness of the Ghadar that aimed to subvert the settled imperial connectivity of the global, whether in terms of the form of the postal system or the telegraph. This was achieved by taking violence as strategic communication, with the individual as the mobile sacrificial subject that summoned the world as its stage. So there is a fictional quality to these episodes here, and this is the quality that made Green Mantle, which was a best-selling novel of the 20th century. I'm surprised there's no film made out of Ghadar till date. Ghadar, through individualized insurrection, created a global geography of interruptions. Territory is one of the central and most powerful ways of imagining and focusing 20th century's nationalism. It was, however, through the subjectivity of violence that objective territory of empire was actually made visible. The Ghadari was ultimately narcissistic, but the Ghadar that powerfully and visibly made extraterritoriality as a militant practice was neither an extension nor the circumvention of the global and of the national, This geography, conducted through the politics of radical violence, in which territory was neither empty, neither simply imagined nor measured, was instead traveled from one locale to another, had no ultimate end or refuge. Ghadar's geography, in short, was neither territorial nor spatially global, but was profoundly phantasmic in that it was visionary, but also illusory. It was very impermanent. Such a geography appeared through a singular acts of violence and then disappeared. It was a landscape of potentiality, never actualized as state power, whether in India or elsewhere. This subjective violence and the figure of partisan were concerned above all with an opening. As a set of practices, it had no unified content and meaning, but as an opening, it pointed to the future. The impossibility of it becoming institutionalized, or rather its steadfast anti-statism, marked the Ghadar as a series of effects that can be glimpsed in other political projects, but these cannot be incorporated or exhausted along those formations. So, of course, people see them as part of Kirti Kisan Sabha in Punjab or Indian communism or even other forms of thing. In its ultimate import, Ghadar attached itself to the dominant predicates of empire and nation as both sources of privation and denial, even as it created a potential in relation to them. Disavowal, negation, defines its relations with empire, and the nation became a source of mystical power for this sacrificial subject. This opening or potentiality, as I said, called into question the strongest principles of both nation and empire. And therefore, it was indeterminate. It was an opening which was a fusion between the active and the dormant, which is why it is vulnerable to appropriation by Indian communism, Indian nationalism, global anarchism, or even as a part of the history of the success of surveillance projects. So its irregularity is open to capture by others, but it doesn't explain it. It is actually an unassimilable phenomenon, much like its actions would remain inexhaustible in its uses. With the self as the founding and conclusion of a politics, its only life trajectories and biographies, which were ruled by disruption, that sought to unsettle the fixity of empire, that give it any coherence. Prior to so in a way, the story is really a bricolage of these biographies, and it's interesting that, and I will end, that Hardayal ends his life as a kind of disappointed public intellectual. He sits with H.G. Wells. He does what a lot of us do, which is goes to the British Library on a daily basis, and is actually unable to even claim. In 1935, he writes his bestseller book, Hints for Self-Culture, and he's unable to even claim the 20 years of this politics that he had actually spearheaded and imagined. And Ghadar actually had, so in a way, it's interesting that he's unable to even, as I said, take authorship for it. Ghadar had deliberately sought a collision with epical events of the last 20th century that highlighted the potency of the self in its planetary dimension. The highly individualized subject had shown the possibilities of restless and sacrificial self. The Ghadari was, by definition, devoid of the cosmopolitan sanctimony that characterized Hardayal's later ruminations on the self. The emphasis here is that this potentiality created the possibility of something that could happen, but does not appear to have been actualized. As a kind of spectral, chimerical actuality, then Ghadar was without predicates. The sacrificial subject, defined by Gadar, sought to violently unsettle the sediments of history. In doing so, it made manifest the condition of a new political possibility. Gadar's focus upon the force of the self and the death drive of sacrifice was not simply depleted or destroyed, but actually was remade by Gandhi, for instance, for a new visible fraternity. So it's interesting that it would be Gandhi who would leave, as it were, offshore India, i.e. South Africa, and return to India to form a new politics of sacrifice in which he would be aware of all this. And Gandhi's nemesis, Savarkar, a leading occupant of the India House in Hampstead in 1910, was, however, forced to return a little earlier than the Mahatma. Savarkar, as I will argue in the next chapter of the book, will pick up this element of secrecy as essential for the birth of a new violent fraternity. Thank you. Hello. Hi, I'm sorry, was I very long?
So it's over and no, ma'am, it was a very interesting and very good lecture. So Himadri, please can you post the questions right now? Ma'am is going to answer all the questions. Thank you, ma'am, for your excellent speech. My query is whether Gadars had belief in socialism. If they had, so what extent? This is a question from Rakesh.
Thank you, Rakesh Deyas. I had to sort of go quite fast, but no, the answer is there was no major socialist or at least coherent or systematic socialism. Ardayal was a critic of Karl Marx, for instance. As I said, it's much more a nihilistic politics rather than a politics that we can easily see. Of course, some of the Gadaris would go back to Punjab and will form the Kirti Kisan Sabha, which will become part of Indian communism. But this moment itself is not which is why I think I spend so much time talking about this kind of, how do I put it, missed connection between Lenin and the Gadaris too. So, they go there, they think they might like this, they might do this, and then something, goes wrong and they're not really convinced and they move away. And you see that with several of them. And the person who actually stays there, as in Virendranath Chattopadhyay, is shot dead by Stalin. And so the answer would be, a more precise answer would be actually no. And therefore, I'd like to think of it much more as a kind of much more, if I can use a shorthand, a much more Nietzschean kind of politics, rather than a politics which is actually about a commitment to some major 20th century ideology as we tend to think about it.
Okay. So the next question, Himadri.
Okay, there are no more questions. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so there are no more questions.
Wait for
okay, ma'am, thank you so.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so yes, can we wait for a couple of minutes?
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I'm happy to call it off too. It's up to you. What happens?
Okay, there is a question. Thank you so much for your great talk. Okay, I was wondering if you could expand on the memory of Gadar in contemporary India, but also the United States.
Okay, so I forgot to show the final slide of my. Thank you, Sami. I wanted to. I had a slide, so I actually went to the centenary celebrations in Jalandhar, and it was really interesting to see what it was about. There's a memorial in Jalandhar where it's a very stark building. It's a nice building. It's done with a lot of dignity. It's where a lot of the archives are there as well. And it's primarily really a hall of all the people who are hanged and people who are imprisoned by this, right? And the centenary celebration itself was interesting because it brought in a large number of various small peasants and left-leaning groups, you can say, from the agrarian hinterland of Punjab. And of course, there was Arundhati Roy, so that kind of attracted a lot of attention. But it was just kind of a march that went through town. So if you don't see it just as the way in which nationalist statist historiography would like to capture this moment as part of India's nationalism, this moment, in a way, this kind of more silent protest or marking was, I think, more apt, where people just, it wasn't about simply freedom or simply revolution, but, it was a kind of homage to these people. So that's what I think is interesting, though, as you know, I think you're working on some of the stuff on Barkatullah and so on, which I think is amazing. The thing is that in the US, it becomes as, in a way, it becomes as a kind of a history of India's immigration, but also the history of laws around regulation of politics and immigration. So it's either seen as I said, I have tried to do something which others have not done for my own reasons. I don't see this as simply a part of history of Indian immigration and diaspora, which it is, but for me, it's more interesting in the way in which mobility is seen to be a self-conscious act of disruption. So whereas immigration is still about making a life there, for most of these Gadris, it's a kind of ceaseless restlessness, which I find interesting. So the memory is there, these people are now heroes and, and the like.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to accept the request from Voices into the Past.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to all the audiences who are watching. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Bye.